Hello and welcome to this next installment in our video mini tours through the Metzger Collection. And today we will be diving into the theme of the Bible and different biblical pieces that connect within archaeological history. Now, this is, of course, a big feature of the Metzger Collection, and one of its particular visions is to highlight the biblical story within the broader context of human history. And so for this video tour, we'll be tracing through the whole of the collection. But this is just brushing the surface, giving you a taste of all the different pieces that you can see. But for now, let's again start off in this section of prehistory and of Mesopotamia. And particularly, I'd like to touch on these couple of fragments that we have here, parts of the Gilgamesh epic. And there we have Gilgamesh at the top there. One of his contacts in the story is the person who survived the Great Flood. And name is not Noah in the Gilgamesh epic. His name is Utnapishtim. But he goes on to relay a flood narrative, strikingly similar to the Genesis account of Noah's Ark. And this particular piece here includes the description of the building of the ship, the storm, and then finally landing on Mount Nisr. We have other ancient Sumerian flood narratives. Among these different ones, they include the bringing in animals, 2 of each kind, sending out birds to see if land has emerged. And so strikingly similar to this Genesis account that we have of Noah's Ark. And again, just this vision of the Metzger Collection to ask this question of how does the biblical story relate to the broader historical context? And do we see this as the biblical authors borrowing from this story, retelling it in a way that says something true and profound about God? Or do we see these pointing back to an actual historical event, and these being a recording of that, a tradition that's been passed down orally generation after generation before finally being written down. And so I leave that interpretation up to you, but I wanted to highlight this parallel that we have here. Now, as we continue next into Egypt, I want to let's go first over here as it relates to Joseph. Now, there's some argument that this reconstruction of a statue found in Egypt could actually be a statue of Joseph. I'm not going to get into that argument today, but what we have over here is an inscription from a tomb. And this shows Asiatics, also known as Semites, paying tribute before Egyptian authorities. And so this is not a direct depiction of Joseph's brothers, but this helps us understand the story when Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to obtain bread in the midst of a famine, and they come and find themselves in front of their brother. And in similar fashion as Asiatics, as Semites, Joseph's brothers would have dressed like this, would have worn their hair in this type of fashion. And then similarly, brought gifts, bowed down, and kissed the ground in front of the feet of their brother, which fulfilled Joseph's earlier vision, as we have it in the story, of the stars bowing down before that one star, which is what aroused the anger and envy of Joseph's brothers to begin with. I also will come over here to some of our various Egyptian gods, and particularly note the god up here, which is kind of a combination of both the god Ra, god of the sun, and Horus, god of the sky. And so we see the sun disk for Ra, and then Horus is often depicted or associated with a falcon or hawk, And so we have also a falcon here with association with Horus. Now, when we think about the 10 plagues in the book of Exodus against the Egyptians through Moses, I might touch on this statue of Moses some other time. When we think about these plagues, we think about the power of God shown in the context of Egypt. We think about Pharaoh's hardened heart and so on, and eventually the exodus of the Israelites being allowed to leave, freed from slavery, and migrating back to the promised land. Well, these 10 plagues are actually quite, the nature of the plagues are quite strategic in how they target different ones of the Egyptian deities, showing not only the power of God, but a particular type of power where God is more powerful than specific Egyptian deities. And so building up to a climax of the 10th plague, the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, is an attack both on Ra and Horus over the sun and the sky, as darkness covers over the sky. And so some of the broader historical context helps us understand some of the nuances of the biblical narrative as we have it. Next, we have this big obelisk over here. Now, some of the significance of this is that it has on it the first picture we have of any biblical figure. And the whole is called Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and it's a victory stele that is boasting the accomplishments and feats of this Assyrian king. And particularly on this second panel from the top, we see the first picture of any biblical figure, this being not the most flattering picture of Jehu, king of Israel, shown bowing down, kissing the ground in front of the Assyrian king, Shalmaneser III. We know it's Jehu from this cuneiform script, a caption for the picture, as it were, above. And it says, "Tribute of Jehu, son of Omri." And the way this tribute is Jehu comes bearing gifts all the way around in his entourage. It continues on the other side, bringing gifts of tribute to Shalmaneser III. And so this whole second row all the way around relates to Jehu and Israel's tribute. And so this is a 9th century black obelisk of limestone, and again, the earliest picture of any biblical figure. Now, as we continue on, we come to an image here of Baal or Baal, Canaanite god of thunder, much the same as we would have Thor or Zeus, gods of thunder. And so we see in his hands the hammer or mace making that thunderous sound, lightning bolts in his other hand, Canaanite god of thunder, storms, and with it, rain and fertility. Now, Baal is mentioned repeatedly in the biblical account as this object of worship among the Canaanites and increasingly among the Israelites as well, as they fall into the idolatry of the neighboring tribes. And we can understand a little bit of the allure of such worship when we understand that fertility, in terms of crop fertility and even human reproduction, is a core human need. And according to the cult of Baal, if you perform a certain ritualistic act, you are essentially forcing that God's hand to give you fertility. Whereas, of course, the worship of Yahweh and obedience to the Torah is quite a bit more involved and all-encompassing. And so we see this allure of this shortcut to the end of fertility. And we also have this account in the Bible of Elijah and a challenge to the prophets of Baal atop Mount Carmel, whose God can light their respective altar on fire, with fire from heaven, in other words, lightning. Now, I'm sure the prophets of Baal were very confident, as this was their God's particular trick, so to speak. And yet, their God can do nothing. And God beats Baal and his prophets at their own trick. Continuing on, of course, there's lots in this section that I could talk on. I could have especially mentioned the Cyrus cylinder again, but since I mentioned that last time, I'll instead talk about a little before the return from exile under the Persians, even before the Babylonians who exiled the southern kingdom of Judah. We have the Assyrians and their attack and conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel, but in fact also their attack on the southern kingdom of Judah. And we have particularly in the back corner here what's called the Sennacherib's prism, or also called the Taylor prism. And in it, King Sennacherib of Assyria boasts the conquest of 46 cities of Judah, fortified cities of Judah, and ends off with this siege of the last and greatest of Judah's cities, that is Jerusalem. And in it, Sennacherib says, "I shut up Hezekiah the Jew like a bird in a cage within Jerusalem, his royal city." Now, in spite of Sennacherib's efforts, he was unable to penetrate the city's walls and was forced to retreat, sufficing to impose a heavy tribute upon Hezekiah. The prism inscription is the most detailed Assyrian description of the episode related in the Bible, which we have the quote, "In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them," which is from 2 Kings 18:13 and Isaiah 36:1. Now, in preparation for the siege of Sennacherib, Hezekiah made various preparations, as well as seeking the Lord in the time of the prophet Isaiah, such as the tunnel from the pool of Siloam within the walls of Jerusalem to the Gihon spring outside of the walls, various grain stores set aside to prepare for siege. On the one jar handle would be Lamelech, the seal of the king, and on the other side, the stamp of the official in charge. This one particularly is dated to the time of Hezekiah, between 705 and 700 BC. And so this time of siege and particularly this mention of Hezekiah is quite significant for the biblical story. Now, as we continue into Greece, we are in the intertestamental times between, at least for Protestants, the conclusion of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. But it is the time of the Apocrypha, recorded in the history through the book of Maccabees. And we particularly read how the Jews were interacting with the Hellenization imposed by Alexander the Great. And we particularly, it's interesting to think about athletics in this context, how the Greeks established gymnasiums in cities across their empire, including Jerusalem. And how this actually prompted some scandal among the Jews, as there was tension with obedience to the Torah, and especially this idea that the games, and here we have a bronze relief showing Greek athletes in a race. The games were done in honor of the gods, but also simply the fact that the games were done naked. which would um, be somewhat of a scandal among the Jews, and perhaps created some additional tension around circumcision and that sign of the covenant among the Jews. So there's increasing tension, which ultimately breaks out in the Maccabean revolt. Now we're going to continue into our Roman Empire section and particularly talk about Caesar Augustus, who we have here. And the Gospel of Luke is especially notable for naming two Caesars, helping us to date the life of Christ. And Caesar Augustus is one of those Caesars named. And we're used to hearing about this, especially at Christmas. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken. So Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem, where Jesus was born. And so his census and his reign is the context of Jesus's birth. Now, this detail of needing to go to Bethlehem, to the hometown to register, is affirmed in this later census document. This isn't one by Caesar Augustus by any means. This dates to around 104 AD, but includes this stipulation that one needed to, or taxpayers needed to return to their original homes for registration. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Last time I talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we have back there, as our oldest Old Testament manuscripts that we possess to this day. And so for today, I want to touch on our oldest New Testament manuscript. And that is this one here. It's Ryland's Papyrus 52, or P52. Now, again, this is our earliest known New Testament manuscript date. It's dated from between 94 and 150 AD. And it is a fragmentary piece of the Gospel of John. On the one side, it has verses 31 to 33. And on the other side, verses 37 to 38. Actually, let me open this up so you can see the back side as well. And so there is the back side of this papyrus. Now, this is, as far as ancient texts, this is incredibly early. Depending on the tradition you follow for the Apostle John, and whether you subscribe to him as the author of the Gospel of John, this could potentially fall within his lifetime. And though it wouldn't have been written by him himself, this is done by an Egyptian hand and was found in Egypt. The fact that it's on two sides also suggests that it was part of a codex, that is a book form rather than a scroll form. And so a very, while it's small, definitely a very significant fragment in our biblical text. We also have over here, this is Artemis of the Ephesians, or Diana would be the Latin name of the Ephesians. Now, this is different from the goddess of the hunt, the Greek Artemis. This is quite clearly a fertility god, represented through whether they are breasts or eggs in the middle. We read in Acts 19:34 how the silversmiths of the city of Ephesus actually incited a riot against Paul and the gospel for the adverse effect it was having on their business. And them feeling that this was taking away from the worship and veneration due to their goddess. And so some of the context of Paul's missionary journeys. Now, last time I touched on the Lindisfarne Gospels, and here we have a couple pages from that again. A close cousin of the Lindisfarne Gospels is the Book of Kells that we have here, and from around 800 AD. Now this is our more miniature facsimile, and I've also recently acquired a larger size facsimile, which I'm very excited about. So again, this is Celtic illuminated manuscript of the four Gospels, and you can see how every single page has little flourishes, and then there's number of full page miniatures, they're called, or illuminations. My favorite, here, I'll show you my favorite. It's up near the beginning here, is this one here, depicting the four Gospels, the four evangelists. Top left is Matthew, top right is Mark, then Luke and John, associated with the four creatures around the throne that we get in Ezekiel and in Revelation. And just many of these images are simply stunning in the Celtic insular style. Probably among the most famous is what's called the Kai Rho page. So the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and the intricate detail of this, which can't quite be captured on this video, but incredible artistry. Now, for the last section that we're going to touch on, I'm going to take us again to the last section for the Reformation. And this repeats a little bit of what I said earlier, but I want to highlight some of the impact of the Reformation on how we have access to the Bible through these three Bibles I have on the table here. The first one is called the Bible of Borso d'Est. And it is an illuminated manuscript dating from, was created between 1455 and 1461. And this is one of two volumes for the whole Bible. And you can see that every single page is just abundantly flourished with illuminations. And so the text itself would have been handwritten, but then all these illustrations would have been hand painted. And so this took 6 years, several hands, and an exorbitant fortune to produce this Bible. In fact, it was produced as a way to sort of boast of the accomplishment of the Este family in competition with the Medici family of Florence. And so this being at the high point of the Italian Renaissance, and so simply stunning. But it also highlights the reality that unless you were incredibly wealthy, really you could never afford a Bible like this. It was impossible. Even if you were literate, you wouldn't be able to own a Bible for yourself. And so, in fact, right at the same time that this Bible was being produced is exactly the time that Johannes Gutenberg, who I mentioned earlier, invented this Gutenberg printing press and printed the Gutenberg Bible. And so all of a sudden, the ability to mass produce texts. Again, as I said earlier, this is still quite a cumbersome endeavor, and is not quick and immediate. But what this did for the accessibility of the Bible in terms of affordability and enabled increase in literacy. Though the Gutenberg Bible, as we have it, is still Latin, still the language of elites, of academics. In the midst of the 16th century Reformation, we have this work of translating the Bible into the vernacular languages. And Martin Luther is particularly a notable one for doing this. And this is the Luther Bible. Again, like with these other two, this is one of 2 volumes. And so the images that we have here are not each individually hand-painted as we had with the Bible of Borso d'Est, that this is painted woodcut. And so an image, wood carving that is painted and then printed into the book. And so the text that we have printed through the Gutenberg printing press, and Luther himself translating not from the Latin Vulgate, but instead from the Hebrew and Greek originals. The Luther Bible is one among many vernacular translations that we have coming out in the midst of the Reformation, and shows this incredible access to the Bible, which is something that really nowadays we take for granted. If we think of how many Bibles we might possess at home, or even how many Bibles translations, versions of the Bible we can get on our smartphones or on our computers. And so it's important to remember this has not always been the case, that we have such access to the Bible. And so I hope you enjoyed this tour through the theme of the Bible, which again, it just touches the surface of the wealth of artifacts that we have as they relate to the Bible in the Metzger Collection. And so I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for our next video.